There comes a moment in history when silence is no longer peace, when the world, heavy with noise, suddenly pauses, because a single voice dares to speak truth. That was the Ibrahim Traoré moment. A young captain from Burkina Faso stood before his people not with a crown, not with wealth, but with a word. And that word echoed far beyond Africa. He said, "Africa will never kneel again." Simple, quiet. Yet it rolled across deserts, crossed oceans, and found its way into the hearts of those who still remember chains, ships, and prayers whispered in the dark. Brothers and sisters, this message isn't just for Africa. It's for every soul that's ever been told to stay down. It's for the elders who built with faith when the world offered nothing but fear. If you believe that voices of freedom must never be silenced, subscribe and walk with us today. Because this isn't just news, it's a call to remembrance, a call to rise. It was a morning like any other in Ouagadougou, the kind of morning that carries dust, sun, and the smell of red earth. But something was different that day. The air itself seemed to tremble, as though it knew that words were about to be spoken that would outlive the moment. The cameras rolled. The flags behind him barely moved. A young man, not yet 40, stepped up to the podium, dressed not in gold, but in a soldier's uniform faded by time and duty. His name was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His eyes didn't search for applause. They searched for truth. He looked out upon his people, farmers, mothers, soldiers, students, and in that gaze, you could see every ancestor who had ever refused to break. And then, in a voice steady and clear, he said, "Africa will never kneel again." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Even the wind seemed to stop, as if heaven itself leaned closer to listen. Then came the sound, not thunder, but the roar of thousands rising to their feet. Tears ran down faces that had seen too much sorrow. Hands clapped that had built nations from dust. In that instant, it wasn't just a speech, it was a resurrection. That, my brothers and sisters, was the Ibrahim Traoré moment. The kind of moment the world tries to hide, yet cannot erase. Because when a people remember who they are, no power on earth can make them forget again. Across the continent, radios buzzed with static. Some stations cut the feed too bold, too dangerous, they said. But the words had already escaped. They traveled from village to village, from one weary heart to another. From the deserts of Mali to the shores of Ghana, from the crowded streets of Dakar to the silence of forgotten villages, the words spread like dawn breaking over a long night. And in that spreading light, something began to stir, something ancient, something buried. It was not anger alone. It was memory. It was pride wrapped in pain, faith reborn from fire. Elders began to speak again of Sankara, of Lumumba, of Nkrumah, names once whispered, now spoken aloud. You see, they said, the spirit never died. It was waiting for a voice. And now that voice had come wearing a captain's uniform and carrying the weight of a continent's hope. But even as people rejoiced, the powers that be began to tremble. In distant boardrooms, men in suits frowned. In foreign capitals, analysts scribbled notes. What does it mean when a small nation speaks with such power? What happens when a young man dares to tell the world that Africa will not kneel? Because the world, you see, had grown comfortable with the image of a kneeling Africa, grateful for aid, silent in suffering, obedient to order. But that day, something changed. A seed of defiance, watered by truth, began to grow. And you could feel it not just in Burkina Faso, but in Harlem, in Detroit, in Atlanta. In every elder who ever said, "We are still standing. This was not politics. This was prophecy. And prophecy always makes the powerful uneasy. So they called him names: rebel, radical, threat. But he called himself what he always was, a servant of his people. My friends, history does not move by accident. It moves when courage meets conviction. And that morning, when Captain Traoré lifted his head, Africa lifted with him. He didn't just speak for a nation. He spoke for every mother who had buried her sons in silence, for every field that had fed the world but starved its own children, for every man who had been told his skin was a burden rather than a crown. That is why, even now, those 6 words still ring with fire. Africa will never kneel again. And somewhere, across the ocean, hearts began to beat faster. Because though the world calls it an African moment, the truth is it was our moment. A mirror held up to every descendant of struggle. But every resurrection brings resistance. Every awakening invites opposition. And what followed his words would test not just one man, but the spirit of an entire continent. Because the speech was only the beginning. The real battle, the unseen one, was yet to come. They thought the fire was only in Africa. But when the wind blew, even America began to feel its heat. When the sun rose again over Ouagadougou, the dust still carried the echo of that voice. But beyond the borders, the winds were changing. At first it was whispers, then headlines. Western media called him the fiery captain. Others called him dangerous. And some, those who still remembered what freedom sounds like, called him necessary. Clips of his speech traveled faster than any bullet. They crossed the Atlantic, found their way into homes, churches, and phones, into the hands of young men scrolling in Detroit, into the hearts of grandmothers watching from Atlanta, into the prayers of elders in Mississippi who said softly, "That young man, he reminds me of something we lost." That was the Ibrahim Traoré reaction. A reaction not of fear, but of awakening. Because somewhere deep in the soul of every African descendant, from the plantations of Louisiana to the savannas of Mali, there lives a memory of standing tall before the storm. And so, the people began to speak. Social media burned with fire, not gossip, but gospel. The captain said, "Africa will never kneel again," one woman wrote. Another replied, "Then maybe we in America should stop bowing too." Brothers and sisters, do you hear the rhythm? It was more than politics. It was prophecy finding a pulse again. For decades, we were told that leadership must come from wealth, that respect requires approval from outside our house. But Captain Traoré stood in front of the world and said, "We are enough." No teleprompter, no consultant, just conviction wrapped in simplicity. In the streets of Burkina Faso, children began to march with small flags, homemade, hand-drawn, bright with the colors of their land. They didn't shout slogans of hate. They shouted, "We are free," and that, beloved, is what frightened the world most. Not guns, not armies, but unity. Because unity is a sound the powerful cannot control. It is the one drumbeat they cannot silence. Meanwhile, in Paris, in Washington, in Brussels, the suits gathered. "What do we make of this captain?" they asked. "Is he a threat to stability?" And by stability, they meant silence. But the silence had already been broken. You see, every generation has its voice, and this was his. Traoré didn't ask permission to speak. He spoke because history demanded it. And when he did, something ancient stirred across the ocean. In Harlem, pastors quoted him from their pulpits. In Chicago, activists painted murals of his face beside Malcolm X. In Ghana, students wrote his name in chalk on school walls. Do you feel it? one elder asked another in a small cafe in Accra. The spirit of the young Sankara walks again. Yes, the world could censor videos, but it could not erase the vibration of truth. And that truth was simple. A generation tired of kneeling is harder to control. My brothers and sisters, we've seen this before in the marches of Selma, in the sermons of Dr. King, in the fire of Garvey, in the rage of Malcolm. The names change, but the melody remains. And once more, it was being sung from the heart of Africa to the soul of America. But not everyone heard it as music. Some heard it as a warning. In the offices of power, phones rang. Aid packages were reviewed. Contracts reconsidered. Ambassadors concerned. The dance of diplomacy began, polite smiles covering sharp teeth. Still, the people rejoiced. And joy, my friends, is the most dangerous weapon against oppression. It tells the world, you may control our bodies, but not our spirit. And oh, that spirit began to travel. It crossed oceans, entered living rooms, touched those who had once stopped believing that Africa could rise. In a small church in Alabama, an old woman stood up during prayer and said, Lord, I thank you for reminding us that courage still speaks our language. That right there was the real Ibrahim Traoré reaction. Not hashtags, not politics, but faith reborn. A sense that perhaps, after centuries of silence, the children of the sun were finding their voice again. But you know what happens when light begins to shine? The darkness doesn't disappear quietly. It fights back. And soon, the world that had been watching with curiosity began to respond with fear. Because if Africa stands, then the whole system built on its knees begins to tremble. The captain had spoken truth, but truth, when it shakes the world, always demands a price. And that price was coming, closer than anyone imagined. Every revelation invites retaliation. And after the echo of Captain Traoré's words faded into the wind, the world that profited from Africa's silence began to whisper in darker tones. Meetings behind closed doors, smiles for the cameras, knives for the night, aid suspended, loans delayed, accusations planted like seeds in hungry soil. You see, when the oppressed begin to stand, the powerful always remember how to kneel, but only to sharpen their weapons. Soon, the headlines changed. No longer young leader of hope, now military dictator. No longer voice of the people, now threat to democracy. The same voices that once applauded his courage now painted him as chaos. But isn't that the oldest trick in the book? They praise you when you serve. They crucify you when you stand. That was the Ibrahim Traoré moment the world feared most, not when he spoke, but when his words began to work. Because what if Africa stopped begging? What if Africa stopped borrowing? What if Africa started believing that it was already rich in soil, in soul, in strength? That's the kind of belief that makes empires tremble. And so, the pressure came. Banks withdrew. Diplomats frowned. Even some of his neighbors distanced themselves. But in the streets, the people still sang his name. They sold vegetables wearing his face on their t-shirts. They prayed for him like they once prayed for prophets. And the captain, young, tired, unshaken, looked out the window of his modest office and said to his aides, "They are not fighting me. They are fighting what I represent." Yes, they feared him, but not because of guns, not because of gold. They feared him because he made people remember who they were before fear became normal. Brothers and sisters, there is nothing more dangerous than a people who remember their worth, because when memory returns, control disappears. The same was true in America, wasn't it? When slaves began to hum songs of freedom, masters grew nervous. When women marched, politicians found their courage suddenly shrinking. And when black men and women in the 1960s said, "We are somebody," the earth itself seemed to quake beneath the weight of truth. Freedom, my friends, always frightens those who build their power on your knees. And so they began to isolate him, cutting him off from allies, from trade, from comfort. The more he refused to bend, the more they called him stubborn. The more he spoke of dignity, the more they said he was dangerous. And yet, he never cursed them. He simply said, "We will work with those who respect us, and if none do, we will build alone." Alone. That's the word that scares both Africa and America the most. Because alone means accountable. Alone means independent. Alone means free. But tell me, brothers and sisters, what's the price of kneeling if standing costs your chains? The fear of freedom is not just Africa's burden, it is the world's addiction. People say they want liberty, but few are ready for its loneliness. True independence means you feed yourself, you fail by your own hands, you grow without permission. And the system built on control cannot afford that kind of courage to spread. So they turned to propaganda, the soft weapon of the new age. They sent cameras not to tell truth, but to twist it. Every pause in his speech became proof of madness. Every reform became a threat. Every alliance became anti-Western. But the people saw through it. And that, beloved, is what frightened the powers most. When truth is no longer controlled, their kingdoms of illusion begin to crumble. Somewhere, in a quiet home in Maryland, an old veteran watched the news and whispered, "They're trying to do to him what they did to our leaders back in the day." And he wasn't wrong, because history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. The same hands that wrote about liberty also wrote contracts of slavery. The same mouths that preach democracy still decide who deserves to be free. Captain Traoré stood in the middle of that storm, unbowed, unbroken. And even as sanctions fell and threats circled, he refused to kneel. He said to his people, "If hunger comes, we will eat what we grow. If isolation comes, we will stand together. We were poor before, we can survive again." That kind of resolve confuses the rich. They do not understand faith that feeds itself. So I ask you now, brothers and sisters, if this young man can stand against the tide for his people. What are we doing with our freedom here in America? Are we building, or are we begging? Are we protecting our truth, or renting it to the highest bidder? Are we still kneeling in ways too comfortable to see? Because his fight is not far away. It's in our schools, our families, our churches, our choices, and the question he throws back across the ocean is simple. Do you believe America would allow such a voice to rise on its own soil today? Because while they fought him with sanctions, they feared something greater, the sound of the same awakening starting to echo in America. Across the ocean, America watched. Some with curiosity, some with fear, and some with a quiet, unspoken recognition. Television anchors spoke his name with caution, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Their smiles polite, their tone uneasy. They used words like controversial, unpredictable, and populist. But behind those labels lay something deeper, a trembling question. What if this young African leader had spoken a truth America no longer believed in? Because, beloved, freedom sounds different when spoken by the once enslaved. It doesn't boast. It bleeds. It doesn't demand permission. It declares deliverance. And as Traoré's voice spread through YouTube clips and sermons online, America began to split not by race this time, but by remembrance. In the black churches of the South, elders leaned forward in their pews. They saw in him a reflection of what used to live in their own pulpits, that fearless conviction that once thundered through the words of Dr. King, that fire that once burned in the eyes of Malcolm. In college classrooms, young students debated. "Is he brave or reckless?" one asked. Another replied, "Maybe both. But isn't that what change has always looked like?" And in the living rooms of Middle America, people changed the channel. Because deep down, they recognized something uncomfortable that every empire, no matter how proud, fears: the sound of freedom spoken in another language. To some Americans, Traoré was a rebel, a reminder that the world was shifting, that the control once held by a few was slipping through fingers like sand. But to others, especially those whose roots trace back to the cotton fields and the slave ships, he was a mirror. A mirror showing not what America is, but what it forgot to be. You see, America once preached self-reliance, faith, and resistance to tyranny. But now it sells convenience, compliance, and silence. So when they saw a man standing alone before nations and saying, "We will survive without your approval," something in their spirit stirred. Some felt threatened, some felt inspired, and some felt ashamed that courage now had an accent, that the gospel of freedom was being preached from the land they once called poor. The truth is, America didn't just watch Africa that day. It watched itself and didn't like what it saw. Because when a man with no money, no machine, and no permission speaks truth to power and lives to tell it, the myth of supremacy begins to crumble. So I ask you, brothers and sisters, if Captain Traoré's voice can awaken Africa, could it also awaken the conscience of America? Or has the dream of freedom grown too comfortable to be challenged again? Because if Africa is rising, then maybe, just maybe, America's spirit must rise too. And that is the beginning of the road ahead. When the shouting stopped and the cameras turned away, something sacred remained, not in the headlines, not in the speeches, but in the hearts of those who had listened. The world had heard the captain's words. Now the question was whether it would live them. Because the Ibrahim Traoré moment was never just about Burkina Faso. It was about what comes after the awakening, what happens when a people begin to see themselves not as victims, but as visionaries. And that, beloved, is where the real journey begins. Across Africa, new conversations started to bloom. Young men planting seeds in dry soil said, "We may not have gold, but we have ground." Mothers whispered to their daughters, "Education is our second independence." Farmers, pastors, and teachers began to speak the same new language, not of despair, but of destiny. This is how revolutions really begin. Not with guns, but with gardens. Not with soldiers, but with sons and daughters who remember that freedom is inherited through action. But the road ahead will not be smooth, because every awakening faces a test. The old powers will not vanish. They will adapt. They will offer deals, distractions, and doubts. They will tell Africa, "You can lead as long as we choose the direction." And yet, even as these temptations rise, something deeper is rising too, a unity that no sanction can stop, a pride that no propaganda can erase. Africa is not just rising from the ashes, it is rising with the memory of every ancestor who refused to kneel. And across the ocean, the diaspora begins to stir. From New York to Lagos, from Kingston to Accra, a single drumbeat grows louder, the rhythm of recognition. The sense that perhaps, at last, the scattered children of one motherland might speak with one voice again. Can you feel it, brothers and sisters? It's in the music. It's in the art. It's in the way young black men and women talk about purpose again, about roots, about pride, about self-reliance. The road ahead calls not for anger, but for alignment. Not revenge, but remembrance. Because healing does not begin with hate, it begins with honor. Captain Traoré may have lit the flame, but it is we, the elders, the dreamers, the doers, who must keep it alive. So as Africa rises, America must listen. Because the spirit that freed slaves, that marched in Selma, that sang "We Shall Overcome," is the same spirit now rising in the Sahel. It is not two stories. It is one long sermon, written across oceans and centuries, now being spoken again by a new generation. And when the day comes that Africa and her children finally stand together, the world will have to learn a new definition of power. Because when Africa stopped kneeling, the world had to bow not in defeat, but in respect for truth. There are moments in history that do not belong to one man, they belong to the soul of a people. This, my brothers and sisters, was one of them. The Ibrahim Traoré moment was never about a uniform or a flag. It was about dignity, that quiet, unbreakable thing the world keeps trying to bury. And yet, somehow, it keeps rising again. When Captain Traoré said, "Africa will never kneel again," he was not just speaking to soldiers in Burkina Faso. He was speaking to the farmer in Alabama who still believes in faith over fear. He was speaking to the grandmother in Georgia who remembers when freedom was a prayer, not a privilege. He was speaking to every forgotten child of the diaspora who wonders if their ancestors' dreams still matter. And maybe that is why the Ibrahim Traoré reaction felt different. It was not about politics. It was about prophecy. Because somewhere deep in our bones, we all knew if Africa can rise from ashes, then perhaps America can rise from amnesia. Yes, the road will be long. Yes, the world will resist. But truth does not retire. Faith does not fade. And hope is the one inheritance no empire can confiscate. The Ibrahim Traoré moment reminds us that freedom is not given, it is guarded. Guarded by prayer, by patience, by the persistence of people who refuse to forget who they are. So tonight, as you listen, I ask you this: will you be a witness or a worker? Will you just share the story or live its spirit? Because the world does not need more fans of freedom, it needs defenders of it. If this message moved your spirit, share it. Subscribe, not just with your finger, but with your faith. Let this video be more than sound. Let it be a signal. A signal that truth still travels, that love still leads, and that Africa, at last, is standing tall and calling her children home. And so we close with this prayer. May every nation that once knelt rise again. May every soul that once bowed remember its crown. And may we all, in the name of truth, stand together. Do you believe the world is finally ready to listen when Africa speaks truth to power?